She was a ghost in green scrubs, a facilitator of miracles she was never credited for. He was a god in a sterile kingdom, a surgeon whose ego was as sharp as his favorite scalpel. He cast her out of his temple, shamed her before the assembled acolytes for a sin he himself committed. But the man on the altar, the patient whose life was unraveling thread by thread, saw through the charade. He saw a warrior, and in a voice hoarse with impending death, he asked for her call sign. Now let me take you inside the four walls of Operating Room 3, where a career was about to be executed and a legend was about to be reborn. The air in OR3 was cold, clean, and electric with unspoken tension. It tasted of ozone and bleach, a sterile cocktail that Anna Reyes had long ago come to associate with the precipice between life and death. It was a place of absolutes, of binary outcomes, success or failure, breath or silence. Today, the tension was coiled not around the patient on the table, but around the man standing over him. Dr. Alistair Finch. He moved with the unearned grace of a man who had never been told no. His slate-gray eyes, magnified by his surgical loops, missed nothing and forgave less. He was considered the best cardiothoracic surgeon on the West Coast, a reputation he polished daily with arrogance and contempt for those he deemed his inferiors, which, in his estimation, was everyone. Anna stood opposite him, a silent sentinel. Her movements were a study in economy, a ballet of efficiency honed over a decade of service. A gloved hand offering a clamp before he knew he needed it. A quiet adjustment to a monitor he hadn't glanced at yet. She was an extension of the surgical process, her purpose to be invisible, seamless, and perfect. Any deviation was a flaw. "Suction," Finch commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated with impatience. The word was not a request. It was an indictment of the universe for not anticipating his need a full second sooner. Anna was already there, the tip of the suction wand hovering, then dipping into the chest cavity with practiced ease, clearing the field. Her eyes were fixed on the vital signs monitor, watching the delicate dance of numbers. Heart rate, 110. Blood pressure, 90/60. A little low. The patient, a man whose chart listed him only as John Smith, a clear VIP pseudonym, was stable but brittle. Finch worked on the aortic valve, his movements fast, but lacking their usual surgical finesse. He was rushing. There was a fundraiser that night, a gala in his honor. He had mentioned it 3 times during the pre-op briefing, a casual reminder to the staff that his time was more valuable than theirs. More valuable, it seemed, than the meticulous pace this procedure required. "Tenotomy scissors," he barked. Anna's hand went to the tray, her fingers brushing over the cool steel. She selected the correct instrument and placed it into his waiting palm with a firm, precise tap. Her gaze flickered from his hands to the monitor. The patient's pressure was dipping again, 88/58. "Pressure's soft, doctor," she said, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the unease knotting in her stomach. "Anesthesiology is pushing a bolus." Finch grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. He didn't look up from his work. "I can read the monitor, nurse." The title was an insult, stripped of all respect and delivered like a verbal slap. He knew her name. He simply chose not to use it. It was then that she saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. He was tired, or distracted, or both. His scalpel nicked a small intercostal vessel, a bleeder that wasn't there a moment ago. A fresh wellspring of crimson began to pool near the retractor. It wasn't a catastrophic error, but it was sloppy, a complication born of hubris and haste. Bleeder, 3 o'clock, Anna stated, her voice still a flat line of professionalism. She held out a hemostat. Finch's head snapped up. His eyes, magnified and monstrous, locked onto hers. The air crackled. He hadn't seen the bleeder yet. She had pointed out his mistake, his imperfection, in a room full of people. She had broken the first and most important rule of his kingdom. The king is never wrong. He ignored the offered hemostat. Instead, he snatched a laparotomy sponge from the tray with such force that 2 other instruments clattered to the floor. The sound was a gunshot in the sacred quiet. "I will tell you when I require an instrument," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. He dabbed clumsily at the blood, momentarily obscuring his own view. "Your job is to stand there and be ready, not to play doctor. Do you understand me?" Anna's shoulders tensed like an internal switch had been flipped. She said nothing. She simply met his gaze, her own expression unreadable behind her mask. Silence was her only available weapon. Her silence enraged him further. He saw it not as deference, but as defiance. He saw her competence as a judgment on his own momentary lapse. He threw the bloodied sponge onto the tray. "You know what? I can't work like this. I need a team that is focused and professional, not one that is constantly second-guessing my every move." He pointed a gloved finger at her, the tip stained with another man's blood. "You, out." The words hung in the chilled air, sharp and unbelievable. The circulating nurse froze. The anesthesiologist slowly looked up from his console. Time itself seemed to stop. "Doctor?" Anna asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You heard me. Get out of my OR. You are a distraction. You're dismissed. For the day. Go home." He turned to the circulating nurse. "Get me a new scrub nurse. Now." Humiliation washed over Anna, hot and suffocating. It was a targeted strike, designed for maximum damage. To be kicked out of an active surgery was the ultimate professional disgrace. He wasn't just firing her from the procedure. He was branding her as incompetent in front of her peers. He was making an example of her. Her training, the part of her that was older and harder than nursing school, screamed at her to stand her ground. But the rules of this world were different. Here, his authority was absolute. She placed the hemostat she was still holding back on the tray with a steady hand. She did not look at him. She looked at the patient on the table, at the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. A silent promise. Then she turned. Every eye was on her. Pity in some, fear in others. No one dared to meet her gaze for more than a second, lest Finch's wrath redirect to them. She was a pariah. She pushed through the double doors, the pneumatic hiss sounding like a final, mournful sigh. The hallway felt a mile long. She stripped off her gloves and mask, dropping them into a biohazard bin with a sense of finality. In the locker room, she sank onto a bench, the adrenaline leaving her system and being replaced by a cold, hollow ache. The surgeon's words echoed in her ears, not to play doctor, out. He had taken her purpose and crushed it under his heel simply because his pride was pricked. She stared at her hands, hands that had packed wounds in the dark, under fire, hands that had held the line between life and death in places Dr. Finch couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. And here, in this temple of healing, they were deemed unworthy. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. An hour passed, or maybe it was 2. Time had become a thick, syrupy thing. Anna had changed out of her scrubs and was staring into her locker, trying to summon the will to pick up her bag and walk out of the building, maybe for good. The thought of facing her colleagues tomorrow, of suffering the whispers and the pitying looks, was unbearable. Then she heard it. A sound that cut through the hospital's mundane symphony of beeps and quiet announcements. A sound that was a shriek. Code Blue, OR3. Code Blue, Operating Room 3. OR3. Finch's operating room. The VIP patient. Mr. John Smith. Anna froze, her hand hovering over her bag. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the fog of her humiliation. It was the feeling she got right before an IED went off, the sudden, electric stillness in the air. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Protocol dictated she stay put. She had been dismissed. She was a civilian now, a bystander. It wasn't her problem, but duty was a stubborn, deep-rooted thing. It was etched into her DNA by years of training and trauma. You never leave a man behind. Never. She moved. She didn't think. Her feet carried her back down the hallway toward the source of the alarm. The controlled calm of the surgical floor had shattered. Nurses and residents were running. A crash cart rattled past her, its wheels squealing in protest. The air was thick with panic. She reached the doors to OR3. They were propped open. She stood at the threshold, a ghost looking back into the world that had cast her out. It was chaos. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor had been replaced by a single, terrifying, continuous wail. Flatline. The patient, Mr. Smith, was in full cardiac arrest. The replacement scrub nurse was fumbling with instruments, her hands shaking. The anesthesiologist was shouting out drug dosages, and in the center of it all was Dr. Finch. His mask was down, his face pale and slick with sweat. The god had become a panicked man. He was performing chest compressions, his movements jerky and inefficient. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, desperate fear. He was losing. "Push another amp of epi," he yelled, his voice cracking. "That's the third, doctor," the anesthesiologist shouted back. "Still no rhythm. Paddles, charged to 200. The defibrillator whined as it charged. "Clear," a resident yelled. The patient's body jerked violently on the table, a grotesque puppet dance. Nothing. The flatline continued its unbroken scream. Anna's eyes scanned the scene, her mind a cold, analytical engine. She wasn't seeing the panic. She was seeing the data, the patient's open chest cavity, the alarming amount of blood in the suction canisters. Far too much for a simple valve replacement. The purplish, mottled discoloration of the patient's skin, a sign of poor perfusion. The readings on the anesthesia machine. And then she saw it, the one critical detail everyone in the room was missing. It wasn't the flatline on the EKG. It was the blood itself. It was thin, watery. It wasn't clotting. Even as they worked, a slow, steady ooze seeped from every incision, every suture line. They were trying to restart a heart, but the man was bleeding out from everywhere at once. It wasn't a cardiac event. It was a hematological catastrophe. Disseminated intravascular coagulation, DIC. A nightmare scenario where the body's clotting factors are all used up, resulting in simultaneous clotting and hemorrhaging. It could be triggered by massive trauma or sepsis. But this was a controlled elective surgery. It made no sense, unless a memory surfaced. A dusty briefing in a tent in Kandahar. A warning about counterfeit heparin from a new supply chain. A bad batch that was causing paradoxical reactions. It induced DIC in a small percentage of patients, particularly those under the stress of major surgery. The symptoms were identical. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold from observer to participant. "Stop compressions," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a razor. It was the voice of command, a tone she hadn't used in years. Every head turned. Dr. Finch paused, his hand still on the patient's chest, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing in here?" he spat, his face contorting with rage. "I told you to leave. Security, get her out of here." Anna ignored him. Her eyes were locked on the anesthesiologist. "It's not his heart. Look at the canisters. He's bleeding out. It's DIC. You're pumping a dead man full of useless drugs." "We have to follow ACLS protocol," the resident stammered, looking nervously between Anna and Finch. "Your protocol is killing him," Anna said, her voice dropping, each word a chip of ice. "The epi is making the coagulopathy worse. He needs blood products, all of them, FFP, cryoprecipitate, platelets, and he needs factor 7, now. You have maybe 2 minutes before it's irreversible." Finch finally found his voice, a bellow of pure, indignant fury. "She is a nurse. She is not qualified to make that diagnosis. I am the surgeon in charge, and I say we continue." "No." The word was a barely audible rasp. It came from the man on the table. It was impossible. He had been clinically dead moments before, but the brief pause in compressions, the momentary change in pressure, had allowed a trickle of oxygen to reach his brain. His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they were alive, and they were focused. Not on the famous surgeon shouting above him, but on the quiet, disgraced nurse standing at the foot of the table. He saw her, really saw her, not the green scrubs. He saw the set of her jaw, the unwavering steel in her eyes, the way she stood, perfectly balanced, ready for action. It was a posture he had seen 1,000 times before, in the green zone, in the FOBs, in the belly of a C-130 flying into hell. It was the posture of a soldier. His gaze flickered down to her hands. He saw how she held them, slightly curled, never fully relaxed. He saw the faint silvery scar just above her right thumb. His lips, cracked and blue, moved. He formed a single, nonsensical question, a whisper that was almost lost in the hum of the machines. "Tourniquet, high and tight?" It wasn't a question. It was a key, a challenge and a password. It was a phrase from the first line of the TCCC handbook, the Bible of every combat medic. A phrase no civilian would know or think to ask. It was a signal flare fired in the dark. Anna's mask hid her expression, but her eyes locked with his. The world fell away. The beeping, the shouting, Dr. Finch's sputtering rage. All of it vanished. There was only the man on the table and the question that bridged 2 worlds. Her training, the real training, surged to the forefront. The nurse receded. The medic took over. She answered the countersign without a flicker of hesitation, her voice clipped and precise, every syllable packed with years of muscle memory. "Applied and holding, sir," she replied. Then she switched gears, her diagnosis snapping through the air like a rifle crack. "Massive hemorrhage protocol indicated. Suspect contaminated heparin-inducing fulminant DIC. Recommend immediate cessation of ACLS. Initiate MHP. Now." The man on the table, this John Smith, held her gaze for a second longer. A flicker of understanding, of confirmation, passed between them. He was a general. She didn't know his name, but she knew his rank as surely as she knew her own. You could see it in the eyes. With the last of his strength, he turned his head slightly toward the stunned anesthesiologist. His voice was a ghost of a command, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of authority. "Do it," he breathed. "Listen, to her." and then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again. But it was enough. The general had spoken. The order had been given. The anesthesiologist stared at Anna, then at the general, then back at Anna. The chain of command had been shattered and reformed in an instant. He nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. He trusted the dying general over the screaming surgeon. "Get me the MHP cooler," he yelled to the circulating nurse. "Call the blood bank. Tell them we need factor 7, emergency release." The entire dynamic of the room shifted. The chaos coalesced, finding a new center of gravity. Anna. Finch stood there, utterly sidelined, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "This is insane! You are all risking your licenses! I am in charge here!" No one was listening. Anna moved to the head of the table, taking charge as if she were born to it. "Forget the factor 7. It'll take too long. Get me the prothrombin complex concentrate from the crash cart. It's faster." What was his last INR? 1.1, a resident answered, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "Okay, we push the PCC, then start hanging plasma and cryo simultaneously. I need 2 large-bore IVs now. And someone get that heparin bag and mark it for the lab. We need to confirm the contaminant." Her orders were a cascade of calm, logical precision. The team, which had been floundering under Finch's panicked command, now moved with a unified, desperate purpose. They had a leader. They had a plan. They responded to her authority as if she had been wearing command stripes all along. Anna worked, her hands sure and steady. She helped secure the lines. She called out dosages. She directed the flow of personnel and equipment. She was a conductor, pulling a symphony from the brink of cacophony. She moved around Dr. Finch as if he were a piece of furniture, a useless obstruction in the field of operations. He just stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his face a mask of impotent rage and utter humiliation. He had been overthrown in his own kingdom, by a nurse he had fired, in front of his entire team. For 15 minutes, the battle raged. Bags of plasma, platelets, and cryoprecipitate were hung and replaced. Drugs were pushed. Anna's eyes never left the monitor, watching for the slightest change. Then it happened, a single, hopeful blip on the EKG. Then another, and another, a ragged, chaotic rhythm at first, then slowly, miraculously, settling into a steady sinus tachycardia. The flat line was gone. The patient's blood pressure, which had been non-existent, began to register. 70/40, then 80/50. The oozing from the incisions slowed, then stopped. The blood was clotting again. A collective shuddering sigh of relief went through the room. The anesthesiologist looked up at Anna, his eyes wide with awe over his mask. "Pressure is holding at 90/60. He's stabilizing." Anna nodded, her work not yet done. "Good. Let's get him packed and closed. We need to get him to the ICU. The next 12 hours are critical." She had saved him. In the face of catastrophic failure, she had looked into the abyss and pulled him back. It was at that moment, as the first wave of relief washed over the exhausted team, that a new presence appeared at the door. 2 men, both dressed in immaculate dark suits, their posture rigid, their eyes sweeping the room with cold professional assessment. They were followed by a third man, an Air Force colonel in full-service dress uniform, his chest a constellation of ribbons, his face carved from granite. He strode into the OR, his polished shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He ignored the medical team. He ignored the recovering patient. His piercing gaze landed on one person, and one person only, Dr. Alistair Finch. "Dr. Finch?" the colonel asked, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Finch, who was still standing by, stunned and useless, seemed to shrink under the man's gaze. "Yes, who are you?" "I'm Colonel Evans, United States Air Force. I'm General Thorne's Chief of Staff." He gestured vaguely toward the man on the table, whose true identity was now revealed. "This entire wing of the hospital is now under military authority. You, sir, are relieved of your duties. Please wait outside. You will be debriefed." It was not a request. Finch sputtered, trying to regain some semblance of his shattered authority. "Now see here, this is my hospital, my patient." "You are mistaken on all counts, Doctor," Colonel Evans cut him off, his voice dropping to absolute zero. "Now, I suggest you do as I say." Defeated, Finch turned and shuffled out of the room, his career and his reputation bleeding out on the floor behind him. The colonel watched him go before his eyes moved, scanning the room until they found Anna. The other staff members instinctively stepped back, clearing a path between them. A long, silent moment passed as he studied her. He took in the blood-flecked scrubs, the exhaustion in her posture, and the unyielding strength in her eyes. He had her file. He knew exactly who she was. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of profound respect. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, addressing her by a name and rank no one in that room had ever heard. "It's good to see you're still on the line." The remaining staff stared, their mouths agape. Sergeant Reyes, the quiet, efficient scrub nurse they all knew as Anna? The woman Finch had just tried to destroy? The revelation rippled through them, a shockwave of disbelief and sudden, dawning comprehension. Her impossible calm, her decisive command, her esoteric knowledge, it all clicked into place. She wasn't just a nurse, she was something else entirely. Anna met the colonel's gaze. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. "Just trying to keep my head down, Colonel." "Well, so much for that," Evans said, with the ghost of a smile. He turned his attention to the now stable patient. "The general is a fighter, but he had help today. He wants to see you as soon as he's able." "I'll be here," Anna promised. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. A specialized military medical team arrived and took over General Thorne's care, preparing him for transport to Walter Reed as soon as he was stable enough to fly. Colonel Evans, true to his word, had taken charge. Hospital administrators scurried about, their faces pale with panic, trying and failing to get answers from the stone-faced colonel. Anna gave her statement, a calm, factual recitation of events. She detailed Finch's initial error, his panicked and incorrect response to the code, and her own intervention. She explained her reasoning for the DIC diagnosis, citing the specific paradoxical symptoms that pointed to a contaminated anticoagulant. When she mentioned the counterfeit heparin theory, Colonel Evans's eyes narrowed. "You've seen this before, Sergeant?" "Not in person," Anna clarified. "But I've read the intelligence briefs. There was a bad batch making the rounds in hostile territory a few years back. Same manufacturer, same lot numbers we're seeing now. Caused a handful of casualties before we locked down the supply chain. I never thought I'd see it in a sterile environment like this." Evans made a note on a small pad. "Dr. Finch oversees procurement for the entire surgical department, doesn't he?" "He prides himself on it," Anna said. "Always talking about efficiency, cutting costs." The colonel's expression was grim. "I think we're beginning to see what that efficiency looks like." The investigation was swift and brutal. With the full weight of a Department of Defense inquiry behind it, the hospital's carefully constructed walls of silence came tumbling down. Evans's team descended on the procurement office and the pharmacy like a SEAL team on a target. They found what they were looking for in less than an hour. The invoices were a work of artful deception. Finch had been approving purchases from a shell corporation, a medical supplier that existed only on paper. This ghost company would purchase cheap, unregulated, and often counterfeit medical supplies from overseas, then resell them to the hospital at a massive markup. Finch received a substantial kickback for every transaction, a kickback that funded his lavish lifestyle. The counterfeit heparin that had nearly killed General Thorne was just the tip of the iceberg. Faulty sutures, unsterilized instruments, diluted antibiotics. It was a systemic infection of greed and corruption that had put countless lives at risk. Finch's mistake wasn't just sloppiness in the OR. His real mistake was letting his scheme endanger a 4-star general. He had brought the full, righteous fury of the United States military down on his head. By the next morning, the hospital was swarming with federal agents. Dr. Finch was taken into custody from his sprawling mansion, led away in handcuffs while a local news helicopter hovered overhead. The gala in his honor had been canceled. His name was no longer a symbol of prestige, but of disgrace. 2 days later, Anna was summoned to a meeting, not in a sterile hospital office, but in a secure suite at a downtown hotel that had been converted into a temporary command post for the general's staff. When she entered, Colonel Evans was there, along with 2 stern-faced lawyers in naval uniforms and the hospital's CEO, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. On a large screen on the wall was a live video feed from a hospital room. General Marcus Thorne was sitting up in bed. He looked tired and pale, but his eyes were clear and sharp, the eyes of a commander. "Ms. Reyes," the general began, his voice raspy but strong. "Or do you prefer Sergeant?" "Anna is fine, sir," she said quietly. "Anna, then," he acknowledged with a nod. "It seems I owe you my life." "Thank you," feels inadequate. "You would have done the same for me, General." A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "That's what I like to hear. Colonel, bring her up to speed." Colonel Evans took over, his tone formal. "As you know, Dr. Finch is in federal custody. The hospital board has terminated his privileges and is cooperating fully with our investigation. They have also offered you a formal public apology and a substantial settlement for the professional damages and distress caused by Dr. Finch's actions." He slid a folder across the polished table. Anna didn't even look at it. The general spoke again from the screen. "We both know that's not what this is about. I've read your file, Anna, the complete one. Decorated 18D, Special Operations Combat Medic. 3 tours. Silver Star, Bronze Star with a V device. You ran a field hospital for 2 days by yourself after a complex attack took out the entire command staff. You left the service with a full medical discharge and the highest recommendations. Then you came here, to this quiet civilian hospital. Looking for peace, I imagine." Anna simply nodded, her past laid bare in the quiet, air-conditioned room. "Peace is overrated," the general stated. "Purpose is what matters. You have a purpose, Anna, a skill set that is exceedingly rare. You have the clinical knowledge of a top-tier medical professional and the field experience of a seasoned combat operator. You understand supply chains, battlefield medicine, and most importantly, you have an incorruptible moral compass. People like you are 1 in a million. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "I am being put in charge of a new joint task force. Our mission is to overhaul and secure the entire medical supply chain for SOCOM operations worldwide. We need to root out the rot that people like Finch represent and ensure that our people in the field have the best, most reliable equipment and medicine money can buy. It's a civilian-led directorate under my direct authority." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The director's position is open. It requires someone who can't be bought, can't be intimidated, and knows the difference between a real hemostat and a cheap piece of steel that will snap under pressure. It requires someone who knows what it's like to depend on that piece of steel to save a life." The offer hung in the air. It wasn't a settlement. It wasn't an apology. It was a crown. It was a chance to go from being a victim of a corrupt system to the person in charge of destroying it. The hospital CEO, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat nervously. "We would, of course, be honored to have Anna return to her position here. We would offer her a promotion, head of surgical nursing, a raise." General Thorne cut him off with a withering look. "I believe she's a little overqualified for that now, don't you?" Anna looked from the defeated CEO to the hopeful face of the general on the screen. The humiliation she had felt in that operating room seemed a lifetime ago. Finch had tried to make her small, to erase her. Instead, he had only revealed who she truly was. He had inadvertently put her in the one place where her unique past would be recognized by the one man who could give her a future worthy of it. She thought about the quiet life she had tried to build, the anonymity she had craved. And she realized the general was right. Peace was a mirage. Purpose was the only thing that felt real. She looked directly at the camera, at the four-star general waiting for her answer. "When do I start, sir?" A broad, relieved smile spread across General Thorne's face. "Welcome aboard, Director Reyes." 6 months later, Anna Reyes walked through the polished corridors of the Pentagon. The green scrubs were gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. The scent of bleach and antiseptic was gone, replaced by the smell of old paper, floor wax, and the quiet, thrumming energy of power. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. People nodded to her as she passed. Colonels, admirals, high-level civilian contractors. They didn't see a nurse. They saw the director. They saw the woman who had, in a few short months, completely dismantled and rebuilt the most critical supply chain in the special operations community. The woman whose name was already a byword for integrity and ruthless efficiency. She entered a secure conference room. A dozen of the military's sharpest minds were seated around a long, mahogany table, waiting for her. She took her place at the head of the table, setting down her things with the same calm, economical movements she had once used to arrange surgical instruments. She looked at the faces around her, men and women responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They were looking to her for guidance, for answers. She had found her place. She had been a healer in the field and a ghost in the hospital. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and nearly broken, but they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten that the quietest soldiers are often the most dangerous. She opened her tablet, the screen illuminating her face. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the one creating them. The war she was fighting now had no bullets or bombs, but it was the most important one of her life. And she was winning. Good morning, she began, her voice calm, clear, and steady. Let's get to work. And in the quiet, confident authority of her voice, the last ghost of Dr. Finch's condescending sneer was finally and completely exorcised. She was home. If you were Anna, would you have accepted the job and the power that came with it? Or would you have taken the settlement and walked away, back to the quiet life you originally wanted? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these stories of justice and vindication. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Every subscription helps our channel grow and ensures that these narratives continue to be told. We have another story queued up for you on the screen right now, and I think you're gonna love it. We'll see you over there.